And welcome to this webinar on post-traumatic stress disorder in veteran and military populations. A very warm welcome to all those of you who've joined us live today. There's a large number of people logged in all around the country, and I think that's a testament to just how important this subject is to the veteran community. Welcome also to those of you who are watching it later on a video cast or podcast, and a very warm welcome to our panel with me here today. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands across Australia on which our panellists and our participants are located. I'd like to pay our respects to their elders, past, present and future. And I'd particularly like to acknowledge the many Indigenous men and women who've served in the Australian Defence Force over many years, including, of course, 2 world wars. My name's Mark Creamer. I'm a clinical psychologist in private practice and also a professor at the University of Melbourne. And I've had a special interest in the mental health effects of trauma for over 30 years, with particular interest in veteran and military populations. And so this topic of PTSD is something that's been very close to my heart for a very long time. And I'm thrilled to be able to facilitate this panel today and to sit with such distinguished guests on the panel. So without further ado, let me introduce them. And we're very lucky today to have 2 veterans with us who have worked their way through PTSD. First, I'd like to introduce Jeff Evans. Jeff is a veteran who's recovered from PTSD. He served for 20 years in the Army Special Operations Command, as well as 12 years as a firefighter. He established the charity Homes for Heroes, and through that and many other initiatives, he's worked for many years at the coalface with some of our most disabled veterans. So welcome, Jeff, and thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Mark.
The other thing I didn't mention, but I did hear about, was something that you're involved in called Team Rubicon. Can you tell us quickly about that?
Yeah, that's right. We just deployed our first mission in response to Tropical Cyclone Debbie up in Proserpine. And what we do is we retrain veterans into disaster response. We put them back on the tip of the spear and throw it back in the fire because disaster zones are dangerous, but they sure aren't war zones. And what we're really doing there is giving people back a sense of purpose and the community they missed when they left defence.
Absolutely. Really valuable. And also, of course, they presumably have a whole lot of skills that they can take back into those situations. Great. Thanks, Jeff. Talissa Papamau served as a combat medic for many years, including on many deployments, before leaving the Defence Force due to mental health reasons. She established the veteran support group Modern Soldier, and also the charity, the Remembrance Foundation, which has a great motto, which is remembering the fallen but honouring the living. And I think that's a great concept to keep hold of. So welcome, Talissa. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks, Mark.
And I also heard that you were involved in a children's book. I was going to make a joke about you taking over from J.K. Rowling, but maybe that's a bit of an expectation. But actually, the project is very important for today, isn't it? Can you just say a couple of words about what this project is?
Yeah, absolutely. So the children's book series is about developing education resources to better educate military children living at home or living in households that are affected by parental mental health conditions.
Right.
So it's about supporting people in our community that are usually overlooked.
Yeah, and it's so important, isn't it? So many of our Middle East veterans had Vietnam veterans as parents, and our Vietnam veterans had World War II vets and so on. So educating the children, I think, is fantastic. It's great. And I should say, actually, that at the end of the webinar, we will have links to all these things that we're talking about available for you. Our third panellist is Dr. Andrew Koo. Dr. Koo, Andrew, is a psychiatrist from Brisbane who has many, many years of experience working with traumatic stress and in particular veteran and military populations. Among his many other roles, he's Director of Medical Services at Toowong Private Hospital. He's got an academic position at the University of Queensland, and he's on the National Advisory Committee of the VVCS, among many other things too numerous to mention. So thank you very much for joining us, Andrew. Good to have you.
Pleasure to be here.
And our final panellist is Dr. Stephanie Hodson. Stephanie is the National Director of the Veterans and Veterans Families Counselling Service, VVCS. She herself is a veteran. She joined the Army in 1991 as a psychology officer. And in 2006, she assumed command of One Psychology Unit, which is the main unit providing mental health support to the Australian Defence Force. She went on many deployments. She was awarded the Conspicuous Service Cross. And I've known Stephanie for a very long time, and I know her to be a very passionate advocate for making sure that veterans and their families get access to the best possible treatment. So welcome, Stephanie, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks, Mark.
Now, I'm afraid I've got just a tiny bit of admin that I have to get through before we start. You've already got a number for technical difficulties. Any problems, ring that number, 1800 733 416. In terms of our structure today, we're going to have about 30 minutes of presentations altogether, perhaps a bit less if we can. And then the second half will be on questions and answers. You've already sent in many questions, so we've been very impressed with the quality and the number of questions that have already been sent in by participants. But also you can send comments and questions in during the webinar, and there's a button on the bottom right hand, I think it is, of your screen to send in a question or a comment. Now, I have to say that we've received a lot already, and no doubt we'll receive a lot through the programme. Indeed, they're beginning to come in already. So please bear with us if we don't get round to your question, but we'll certainly get through as many as we can. A recording of today will be available in a week or so, and we'll send round links to you of how to get that, and it'll be advertised through Facebook and Twitter and all those modern kind of things. And if I could just ask you not to forget, at the very end, we will ask you to complete a feedback survey about how you found it, and that's really important in terms of providing the best possible services to you. Now, before I go on, we thought it would be useful to make sure that we're all starting from the same place in terms of what is PTSD. And so I'm just going to spend a minute or two talking about this diagnosis, post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. And I guess it's probably the most well-known response to trauma, most well-known mental health response to trauma. But I would emphasise that it's not the only one, that we see high levels of depression, we see other anxiety problems, we see substance use. So PTSD is not the only thing, but it is the one that most people know about. And PTSD comprises four main groups of symptoms. So the first is really about being haunted by these horrible memories. It's about re-experiencing the trauma, often through nightmares or images or thoughts jumping into people's minds. And this is very frightening, it's very distressing, and so people try to stop that happening by avoiding any reminders or, as far as they can, any triggers, and also avoiding thinking about it, avoiding talking about it, and even avoiding any feelings associated with it. The next group of symptoms are about negative feelings, so we see some depression and sadness, we see anger and frustration, we see fear, anxiety, worry, we see guilt quite often. And it's also about social withdrawal and isolation, and in more severe cases, just kind of shutting down emotionally and withdrawing into themselves as a way of protecting themselves. And the fourth group of symptoms are really about being constantly on edge and on the lookout for signs of danger and jumpy. We see irritability, we see sleep disturbance and so on. So it's when those four groups of symptoms occur together, we use this label of PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. And we know that this disorder has a big impact on our ability to relate to our loved ones, to our partners, to our children, family, friends, and so on. And it also has a big impact on our ability to function in our role, which might be as a parent or a student or working or whatever. So it does have a big impact on functioning and on quality of life. Comorbidity is also very common. So it's quite common if people have PTSD, they will also have perhaps depression or anxiety or substance use. So today we're going to talk about how we can manage that treatment, how we can treat that condition, and particularly about what it's like to live with it. And so to kick us off with that, I'd like to hand over to Jeff, the first of our panellists, to talk a little bit about his experience of having PTSD and also recovering from it. Jeff.
Thanks, Mark. I'll talk a little bit about my journey with PTSD, and I call it the trifecta because it was PTSD, anxiety and depression. And chances are if you're ticking those boxes, you're probably abusing prescription medications or drinking or using illicit drugs as well as a coping mechanism. Some of the symptoms that impacted my life the most were anger, very, very short temper, which I would later learn is actually related to anxiety. It wasn't actually a choice. Being jacked up all the time, making it through the day but crashing in the evening, tired all day, can't sleep at night, and a feeling of a constant worry about the future. And I ignored it all. Eventually my wife took me to couples counselling, and then she left and I stayed for a very, very long time, and that was the start of my journey. I chose VVCS because VVCS wouldn't disclose to defence. I was still serving it at the time when this set in. They also won't disclose to DVA, so I could confide in them and not have to worry about it affecting my future. If you're watching this now, you're already ahead of where I was, because I just did not recognise the symptoms. Fortunately, my wife did. And you need to give yourself credit for that, because it's the beginning of your journey, and it takes an acknowledgement to realise that there's something going on, and that takes courage. It really does. Hopefully by the end of this you'll learn where to get help. The journey in recovery of PTSD, it's actually very, very hard work. For every 2 steps forward, you'll take 1 step back. It's a very, very long, bumpy road. It's beset with difficulty and setbacks, but it requires from you commitment, hard work, dedication and courage. It's a different type of courage, but it takes courage nonetheless. But if you think about those traits, they're the things that made you succeed in defence. Hard work, dedication, sacrifice, and those are the things you'll need to get through this as well. I found that psychologists and psychiatrists, psychs just weren't psychs. It took me 6 psychologists before I found one I like. I used 2 psychiatrists just to medicate me, and then I did all the really hard work, which is around exposure therapy, with counsellors from VVCS and with psychologists from VVCS. Now, like I said, it took me 6 to find one I liked, and I liked her not because she was nice to me. In fact, she wasn't nice at all, but I found that she was that's what I needed. She was the best practitioner. You're not looking for someone who's nice to you. You're looking for someone who applies a certain set of tools to your situation until they find one that works, and then keeps pressing on it until your symptoms start to subside. It's treatment. It's not about being nice. For me, I found exposure therapy very, very effective. So we would talk over the incidences that were causing me problems over and over again, until eventually, after a very long time, I got to the point where they were just memories. Not nice memories, but the power in the memories, me trying not to think about them, not to feel them. Whenever I relive them, I wouldn't be just talking about the memory. I'd be reliving the experience, complete with adrenaline and horror and all that sort of stuff. Over time, eventually I could just talk about it like it was another event, which is the point. And once you get bored of it, you can probably move on. A couple of tips if you're going to start your counselling. The psychiatrists and psychologists cannot read your mind. They will believe what you tell them. So if you're going to walk in there and tell them you're fine every day, you're wasting your time and theirs. You need to be honest, and that's where the courage comes in. You need to really admit what's going on, and it's not easy to bare your soul to a stranger. The other thing is it's all going to come out in the end. So I sought treatment for 2 specific incidences over a period of years, and my symptoms subsided and I got better, but they just didn't go away. And then there were other issues in my past that came up that I thought I was fine with that eventually came out. My point here is, if you think you're going to go into counselling and just talk about your time in the service, you're probably mistaken. You're going to have to go back as far as your trauma starts, and for many people that's in their childhood. You just need to be prepared for that. It won't just be about your service. And you can't do it alone. You need professional help. I know for certain there will be people who are listening to this podcast who will not heed our advice and think that they can tough it out alone, just like the Vietnam veterans did. And if you look at the statistics of when Vietnam veterans lodged claims with the Department of Veterans Affairs, the peak was actually 20 years after the war. And that's an entire lifetime of suffering before they fell over. And then if you look at the Vietnam Veterans Families Study, you can see how that war played into the children of Vietnam veterans, and then the children's children of Vietnam veterans, when you look at their statistics of mental health and depression and other statistics like that. So don't think that this is just about you. You have an obligation to the people around you as well to seek help if you need it. And look, you can recover. Last year we had a suicide at Homes for Heroes, which was just devastating for us. It was a young man I was trying to help, and I had to go and identify his body. And what I had learnt through my therapy is that it was okay for me to feel bad. I could let those images sit in my mind, and I didn't have to force them away. So, I discovered that I'd become more resilient. Sure, that was a traumatic experience, but it didn't have to become PTSD. Post-traumatic stress doesn't have to become a disorder if you get help quickly, and all the evidence says early intervention is the key. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you very much indeed, Jeff. There's a whole lot of stuff there that I reckon we'll be picking up on later. And also, I'm sure, a whole lot of stuff that our participants out there can relate to extremely well. So thank you ever so much for that. Next, I'd like to come back to Talissa to talk a little bit about her experience of living with PTSD. And if I could start to list, so you developed PTSD after your military service. Can you just say a little bit about what the impact of that was for you?
Yeah, sure. Much the same as Jeff. Post-traumatic stress had a global impact on my life. There hasn't really been an aspect of my life that wasn't impacted by post-traumatic stress. There have been elements that were sort of enduring though throughout my rehabilitation. So these types of things were difficulty maintaining and developing functional and meaningful relationships. Unfortunately, I had a lot of trouble in my interpersonal relationships. A lot of the time I was just emotionally distant, and it really did affect the success of my relationships and some of my friendships as well. The other area that I think has had a fairly large impact is some cognitive deficits, which I think a lot of people don't automatically assume when we're talking about post-traumatic stress, that it can have sort of cognitive impacts. And the sort of area I find it affects me or did affect me quite significantly was my level of concentration. So sort of at my worst, I would really struggle to concentrate, to even watch a movie. I would find my anxiety levels were so high, my turnover of thoughts was so high that I couldn't even follow the plot of a movie. So another area is, of course, secondary mental health and physical conditions, which you've touched on yourself, Mark, and of course, Jeff. Post-traumatic stress is a condition that affects the whole person. And we're seeing more and more research and more lived experiences that really resonate that. I was diagnosed, obviously, with a couple of secondary mental health conditions as well, and post-traumatic stress has impaired things like my digestion, and I have secondary IBS and things like that as well. So I would say that's a definite impact. The severity of my symptoms tend to wax and wane, and I think it's really pertinent that I mention that times like anniversaries, and particularly Anzac days, Remembrance Days, were times that traditionally were very, very difficult for me. I would sort of months out, my anxiety and levels of distress would start to increase. And I would find that I would use huge amounts of energy and emotional resources trying to fight those feelings, trying to put a lid on these things. That eventually I turned around and I decided that I would actually accept the impact that post-traumatic stress was having on my life. And what I found was all that energy I was using trying to keep a lid on things was then freed up to dedicate that to rehabilitation and to getting better.
Great, thanks. And that issue about the fluctuating symptoms, I think, is important, isn't it? I know we had a question sent in before about asking whether or not symptoms do fluctuate, and what you're saying is very clearly that, yes, they do fluctuate a lot. I have to push our speakers on, I'm afraid, so bear with me if I seem to be pushing them along a little bit. You did eventually get into treatment. Can you tell me a little bit about what treatment was like?
Sure. Treatment was and is hard work. I think anything worth doing in life is hard work. I think you need to sort of when you're in the military, you do have a tendency to put the mission above yourself, to put the job above yourself, to put the team above yourself. And unfortunately, when you have mental health conditions or any conditions, physical or whatever, there comes a time and a place where you need to actually reprioritise. And you need to say, my quality of life is failing, my relationships are failing, and I need to do something about that. And if that means that affects my military service, well, you still have your whole life ahead of you to look after. So it was very important, obviously, to build a rapport with my treatment team, and I've had a number of treatment teams. People like psychiatrists, psychologists, exercise physiologists are used heavily for mental health conditions. gastroenterologists, because it does affect the whole person and has many sort of secondary comorbidities and things like that. I think I ended up having quite a comprehensive treatment team. And it's very important to shop around, so,
sure.
Yeah.
Okay, look, thank you very much, Alyssa, and I'm sorry to keep moving along. I want to ask you later about what you found particularly helpful, but perhaps we'll come back to that later. And, you know, really, I would love to spend the whole hour chatting to Talissa and Jeff about their experiences, because it's so valuable and so important. But we do have a commitment to move on and to take your questions as well. So let me hand over now to Andrew to tell us a little bit about what treatment might involve and, what treatments work and so on. So, Andrew.
Thanks, Mark. So, in terms of post-traumatic stress disorder and the core symptoms of this condition, which Mark has taken us through, the mainstay of treatment really is psychological therapy. And what I mean by that is counselling or talking type therapies. Within psychological therapy, at this stage, the evidence would tell us that the most effective types of psychological therapies are ones with what we call a trauma focus. Now, you've heard the word exposure so far today already on the panel, and what we mean by that is exposing an individual to the memories that they have of the traumatic incidents or incident, and this is called imaginal. Or exposing them to triggers in their life that tend to set off memories of their experiences, and that is called in vivo or in life. We call, in terms of these type of therapies, they've got names that have been manualised, if you like, or put into package type treatments. So if you ever hear things called prolonged exposure or cognitive processing therapy or EMDR, these are all types of treatments that have been applied in research to PTSD and have been found to be, at this stage, the most effective types of treatment. I do want to say something about medication, because everybody talks about medication in PTSD and everyone is fearful about medication in PTSD. The first thing I would say about this, and this might seem funny coming from a doctor, but medication is really a secondary treatment in PTSD. It is not the pillar or the first line in the treatment of PTSD. And in terms of its ability to decrease the core symptoms of PTSD, the evidence for that is actually quite poor or limited compared to psychological therapy. So at this stage, it's my belief that medicines take the place of being used to control comorbid or other conditions that can occur with PTSD, like depression or anxiety, or we use them to control severe symptoms that might be impairing an individual's ability to take on psychological treatment, like sleep disturbance, like anger, like high anxiety states or depression. So it's really a bit of a secondary sort of thing. In saying that, if we are going to use medications, antidepressants are the first line treatment. Now, most of the modern antidepressants are very tolerable, effective, aren't addictive, and if taken in the right way, can, for probably a minority of patients, really add significant benefit to their treatments overall. Now, how effective is treatment in PTSD? Well, at this stage, the outcomes in PTSD treatment tend to follow a lot of other chronic medical conditions across the board, and that's what we end up with in results, is what we call the rule of thirds. So a third of people will get very well to the point where the condition does not affect their life anymore. The next third will have a significant response to treatment and will be way better off, significantly better off, but still have elements of the condition that will affect them in certain ways in an ongoing way. And the last third don't tend to get a great deal of benefit from the treatment. Unfortunately, we do tend to preferentially hear a lot more about the last third, which are the people that don't really respond to treatment. But the fact that this third of people exists is actually very important in my belief for PTSD, because what it does is it stimulates ongoing research into new, novel, better treatments, which we'll hopefully be able to apply in the future as we move ahead and become better at dealing with this condition. So What I would say is overall is that PTSD is a very treatable condition, and this is the take-home message. It's a very treatable condition, and as Jeff was saying before, there are many people that are suffering unnecessarily because they believe they're suffering under the belief that this condition isn't fixable, and that is not true, simply not true. The biggest barriers we have, unfortunately, at this stage to treating PTSD is actually getting people into treatment, getting them to self-identify or getting them to come to treatment and then stay in treatment, because it is a long process in terms of the treatment process for PTSD, and requires a lot of input, and it is an up and down process. No one tends to get better like that. We tend to get better like that, going up and down.
Can I just ask you to talk very briefly, Andrew, about some alternative treatments, just very quickly? Yes. Are there other things that might be helpful?
So there are a whole raft of other treatments at this stage we call adjunctive or complementary, and these can include things like treating specific symptom sets like anger and sleep, for example, doing things to help people's anxiety like meditation, mindfulness, yoga, tai chi, etc. We've got other types of alternative types of treatment that we use in other parts of medicine like acupuncture, acupressure, exercise, healthy lifestyle is very important. Adventure type activities have become quite popular and can be very good in terms of social connectivity, and also the use of companion animals.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And again, I'm sorry to push you through. We will come back to a whole lot of that stuff during questions as we talk a bit more about treatment. But at this point, I'd like to hand you over to our fourth panel member, Stephanie, to talk a little bit about the services that are available to veterans. Stephanie.
Okay, so Mark, to start the discussion of access to care, I'd like to show a small video. That video is so important because there has been a significant change in the way that people can access care. A major reform that has come in the last couple of years is the fact that anyone now who has served a single day full-time service in the ADF, not whether you deployed or not, but just a single day full-time service, either CFTS as a reservist or you've actually just worked a day in the ADF, what that actually then means is that you can access mental health care, you can apply to get a white card, and that will give you access to treatment, to subsidised medication for whatever the cause for the rest of your life. It doesn't have to be related to service, and you don't have to actually put in a claim. At the moment, turnaround time, if so, you can either email to get that card, you can make a phone call, and the number will be available attached to this website and this podcast, or you can contact VVCS, the Veterans and Veterans Family Counselling Service. A huge part of that change, the ability for everyone to have a white card for mental health who've got the symptoms. So basically, if you've got the symptoms, you ring up, you make the call, and they'll send you the card out and you can start to get treatment. The other thing that this change has done has opened up access to VVCS, the Veterans and Veterans Family Counselling Service, to anyone who's had a single day service. So many of you out there would be thinking that the service actually was only for people who are deployed, but that has changed. It's now available for anyone who's actually served a single day. What I'd like to say to you though is we're aware that really conscious that sometimes it's really hard to do that by yourself, even to make that first phone call or send the email. And what you can do is just call the 24-hour support line, and we will help work you through going through that process. The reason is, as these guys said here, the key here is early intervention. And what we need to do is to get people into care as quickly as possible before, as Talissa said, because the longer you have the disorder, there's secondary illnesses and symptoms come on. So it's about taking that step, but sometimes you need a friend or someone to talk you through that step, and that's where you can actually ask for that support. The VVCS, the Veterans and Families Counselling Service, is a legacy of our Vietnam veterans. As highlighted by Jeff, our Vietnam veterans fought for this service. It is a free service for veterans and their families and can be accessed by serving members as well. The service has over 1,000 clinicians in it, and the service actually, we work very hard to make sure that those clinicians are military aware and up to date with the treatments that Andrew just talked about. So it's about getting access to a treatment service that will help you find a counsellor who knows about military service and actually is up to date with the best practice treatments. The other point I'd like to say is sometimes it's a little bit hard to say, okay, I want to make this first step. So there are online resources. There's the ADDIES DVA website that you can have a look at. And there's a whole structure of care. Mark, I'll get you to give me the next slide. Thanks, guys. There's a whole structure of care. And the other step, as well as applying for your non-liability, the mental health white card, what you can do is go talk to your GP. The first level of support is basically have a look at the internet. There are great resources, and a good place to start is resources like Modern Soldier or the ADDIES website. Once you've had a look and seen what's available to you, talk to your GP who can organise you that referral or ring VVCS. And from there, they will refer you on to, if you need, one of our bigger PTSD treatment programs, which will allow you to step away from life for a moment and actually deal with some treatment.
Right. Thank you very much, Stephanie. I am going to ask you just one thing, but it has to be very quick because we're running a little bit behind time. But I'm interested in whether there are future initiatives coming up that people should know about. And I know we've got a slide about it, so...
Yeah, and I'll be very quick, Mark. But I think this is really, to give feel like Andrew was saying, we do need to look for how do we do treatment better. So one of the issues is if you're a young person and you've just got out of the military, it's really hard to go and say to your boss, can I have 3 months off work? Or if you're in the military, 3 months out of your career is a long time to go and do one of the bigger PTSD programs. Right at the moment in Australia, we're running a trial where instead of doing your exposure work 1 day a week for 10 weeks, you actually do the treatment every day for 2 weeks. It's been run in the US really successfully, and initial results coming out of the trial are extremely promising. What this means is that people can get that big symptom reduction much faster in a tighter period of time, so it impacts less on their ability to stay involved in meaningful life, stay involved in work, stay involved in their community. For anyone who's interested, we'll have the link on the website, and the trial is running in Brisbane, Sydney and Melbourne.
Thank you very much indeed, Stephanie, and thank you to all our panellists for some tremendous presentations there. We're going to go now into the question and answer part of the webinar. So I remind you that if you've got questions you'd like to send in, please do. In fact, one of them that has just come in is about someone saying that they're too frightened to go and see someone. Is there anything online? So just take note of what Steph said there about a whole lot of resources being available online, and probably the ADDIES website or perhaps the VVCS website is a good place to start. But another thing that people have been asking about, and this is particularly before the webinar, a lot of people sent in questions regarding the identification of PTSD, that it seems as though we're missing it a lot. And that applied both while people are serving, when they come back from deployment, and also down the track. I wonder if I could ask you, Stephanie, do we try to identify PTSD or possible PTSD when people come back from deployment?
Most definitely. And the issue with PTSD is it is an injury. It's an injury that occurs in a life-threatening event. And many of the symptoms of PTSD that Mark talked about earlier are actually highly adaptive while you are still in the operational theatre, being highly aroused, being very alert, watching. In that environment, it's sometimes hard to pick them. The other thing too, so there is screening of people just as they're coming out of the theatre, and every time that screening happens, a number of people put their hand up and say, yep, I've got symptoms. But not everyone at that point has yet recognised that they have symptoms that are going to impact their life. So the next set of screening happens about 3 months when people have got back. So at this point, they've come home, they don't readjust, and the injury starts to impact their life. That group of people will get picked up at that point. Some people come back and they go straight back into very busy jobs. And the trouble is with that is, again, those symptoms are actually still quite productive. You know, you're not getting a lot of sleep, but you're very, very active because you're trying to deal with your anxiety, and you deal with it through work. So it's often not till someone slows down at a point in their life that the injury will come to the fore.
And that's important. So we're doing our best to pick it up early, but it's not always easy. And then they come out into the community, Andrew, and people are saying, look, I saw doctors for years. How come they didn't notice or recognise that I had PTSD? What do you think's going on there?
Well, I think there's a couple of things going on, and I think the other thing that we really need to take note of in terms of identification of PTSD is we very much depend on you, not only to self-identify that something's wrong, which is trouble in itself, as Steph was just talking about then, but also there are significant barriers to people putting their hands up, and these involve things like community-level stigma, individual stigma, the cultural stigma in the military against mental illness and weakness. So the barriers against, you know, if I put my hand up, you know, does this mean that promotional opportunities, you know, opportunities for deployment in the future are going to be affected? So there is a lot of forces pushing against people putting their hands up that we understand and that are difficult to change. Certainly they stick around when people leave the military because they're worried about how those kind of things are going to impact on their ability to get a job in the civilian world. And a lot of people will deliberately cover that up and cover it up so well that they even fool themselves that nothing's going on. So in this way, we often reach the situation where we get this delayed diagnosis of PTSD.
Yeah, which is interesting. And as you say, maybe it's not really a delayed diagnosis, it's a delayed identification, perhaps, is a better way of looking at it. But it is interesting. We had a question again just before about in days gone by, people in the military were told to just suck it up, toughen up, you know, push these things out of the way. And yet we find that increasing numbers of elderly people start to develop PTSD. So it's like, you know, we can push it away for a while, but this stuff is still there and we're going to need to deal with it at some point. So
very much that's the case. And this was really typified by the Vietnam cohort that came home, didn't get the welcome home as heroes that they could have got. They were then sort of assimilated into the community, and it wasn't even till a lot of them retired and they lost the distraction of work that they really started putting their hands up and coming to us 30, 40 years later.
Yeah. So it kind of leads us on to this idea of making this adjustment, this transition out of defence, as Stephanie made the very important point that a lot of these symptoms are quite adaptive while you're serving. It's just they become very unhelpful when you're out. So I wanted to bring in both Jeff and Talissa here to talk a little bit about that process of adjusting to civilian life and how you found it and what the big challenges were for you. Would you like to kick it off, Talissa? What did you find difficult about adjusting?
Oh, I found lots of things difficult about adjusting, and it's still an active process for me. I've been out a little over a year. I did sort of find that relating sometimes to my sort of civilian counterparts was difficult. Military is such a unique experience and a unique environment. Sometimes I sort of discharged when I was 27, and I felt that I didn't have a lot in common with perhaps other women of my age group and that have had sort of a civilian experience. So I think that was sort of a real area there that required an adjustment.
Yeah, I think it's a really important point, isn't it, that your networks don't often understand what you've been through, really. Jeff, can I bring you in, and anything particular you would say about that process of adjusting the transition?
I don't use the word transition because the moment you leave, you drop off a cliff and you are just gone. And you lose all the things that made you you. You lose your identity, you lose the fact that you were doing really, really important work and you're surrounded by an amazing team, you wore a uniform, everything you did mattered. You don't have any of that when you leave. And then if you throw in a mental illness on top of it, suddenly you've gone from being this amazing super soldier, you know, defending the nation to someone who can't get out of bed in the morning.
I think that's a really important point. You have very dramatically put there, you know, that you drop off a cliff. And I guess, you know, we often say that we spend ages training people to be soldiers. We don't train people to be civilians at the other end at all. So
no, we don't. There's a few mistakes we make. If you go back in the conversation we just had, if people identified their PTSD symptoms earlier and came out for help earlier, and we normalised that conversation around, you know, I'm experiencing this, it wouldn't have to become the D necessarily. It doesn't have to become a disorder. But we've got a long way to go before we can maturely talk about what's happening to us when we're in defence or when we leave and we first start seeing these symptoms and the need to get help.
And I think, that's a point that's just being repeated over and over again, isn't it? The earlier we can get hold of this stuff, the better outcome
It is, but it's never too late.
Yeah, exactly. No, I quite agree.
Teresa's doing some work at the moment around transition, aren't you, as a lived experience person, to try and help the department improve that process.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Good. Well, I was thinking we should perhaps go on and talk about treatment a little bit. Andrew gave us a good outline of what the evidence-based treatments are and what helps and so on. We do hear a lot, Andrew, about all sorts of new types of treatment. And again, some of the questions that came in, one was around neurofeedback, one was around TMS, and there are all sorts of these acronyms, BSSF and EFT and all that kind of stuff. So, have we got some kind of magical cure just around the corner that we're waiting for?
Unfortunately, we don't, Mark, have any magical cure, but certainly we need to keep researching all the potential benefits that we can get from all these other types of therapies. At the moment, some of the therapies we call complementary or adjunctive are under sort of greater scientific scrutiny, and they may turn out to be a much more important part of treatment in the future. But we need to gather the evidence first and then and go from there. But the big thing about treatment of PTSD is it needs to be individualised, and I believe it needs to be comprehensive as well. So you've got the psychological therapy at the pillar, and then you build around that the medication, if required, to control symptoms so they can get that. You add in healthy lifestyle that's good for everyone's mental health, okay? Exercise, sleep, controlling alcohol and drugs and this kind of stuff. And then you use your skills or your experience to fit to them what we have as all these extra adjunctive things and what's going to fit best with them, a companion animal, adventure type activities, whatever. But it's got to be individualised and comprehensive.
Just very quickly, we've had a number of questions, but this one actually fits perfectly with what you're saying, so I'll ask it for just a very quick response. Sure. And the question is about, it's from Ray actually, about acupuncture and acupressure. Is it effective or is it just a placebo response?
Okay, so there is some research. There is some research evidence, Ray, for this particular method of treatment. And at the moment, some of the research is saying that it does work. It does have what we call an effect above and beyond placebo, which means it's much better than doing nothing. So at this stage, that's an ongoing area that we're researching. Acupressure particularly is as part of a number of other types of treatments. So we're watching that space.
And Mark, can I add, for anyone who's really interested, off the Addie's website is a great resource called the Evidence Compass. So Phoenix Australia, which is a great organisation that monitors what's happening in the research agenda for VVCS and the Department of Veterans Affairs, they put regular updates on there about what is occurring in the research space. So if you want to monitor what's emerging and what's the evidence, the Evidence Compass is a good place to go, and we'll make sure that there is a link to that after this podcast.
Okay. I was struck, Andrew, though, by your comments, which I agree with entirely, about the rule of thirds, and so we've got a third who are doing really well and we've got a third who are doing moderately well, and we need to remember that's 2/3 of people who are getting a lot of benefit from treatment. Yes. We do have a third whose gains are probably somewhat less and not doing quite so well. But I guess what it does mean is that for a lot of people, it's not some kind of complete and absolute cure and they're never going to experience any symptoms. And part of it, I guess, is about learning to manage these kinds of symptoms in the same way as we might with a whole range of physical disorders. So I want to bring back in Jeff and Talissa about your thoughts or your experiences about living with PTSD. And if I could start with you, Talissa, what do you think were particular strategies? We had a question actually about managing the arousal and the how do you switch off, and triggers and things. So can you just talk a little bit about the strategies you found helpful?
Sure. I find with treatment, my personal approach is to keep it as broad as possible. I've undergone a number of different psychotherapies and then also adjunct treatments as well. And I tend to have, the more tools I have in my toolkit, the more options I have and the more things I can try when I'm feeling particularly unwell. So there are aspects of what they call acceptance commitment therapy, which have helped with my loss of identity and my loss of purpose upon leaving the military. I think a lot of people are a little scared off by the prolonged exposure therapy, but really that actually happens in everyday life the more you become a contributing member to society. Exercise and mindfulness are two areas. I mean, that exercise has been proven to be as effective as low-dose antidepressants, which is fascinating. And so obviously getting out and keeping active has been very helpful to me. And I also have 2 dogs that I absolutely cherish. So.
Yeah, okay. That's very good advice, yeah. What about you, Jeff? What kind of strategies did you find most helpful in terms of managing these?
I think one of the most helpful things that I did very early on was recognise that this was an illness and that I needed to treat it like one. If you get cancer, you'll go and research everything there is to know about it, and then you'll go and try all the different therapies possible until you find something that works and you treat the cancer. If it's a mental injury, suddenly we think we can do it differently, and we can't. So I think I've tried every treatment and every adjunct treatment. Some of it worked, some of it didn't. Some of it I didn't think worked, but, it did. And over time, building all these skills in, my PTSD symptoms dissipated, and I don't think I have it anymore.
Right.
But it was a long process.
Long process, and yeah, exactly. Yeah. Doing some research, I think,
actually,
is really good advice.
I'll add one thing there. One of the other hard things for me to accept was the need to take medications because we're all in defence. Nobody likes popping pills. It never occurred to me at the time that it wasn't forever. This was just a part of the journey, and I don't take medications now. I don't need to, but if I needed to again, I would, and I would take them as they were prescribed to me. Yeah.
And I think that is a really important point because a few people have talked about the kind of pessimism they feel that they're always going to have this disorder or they're always going to have to be in treatment. And as you rightly point out, that doesn't have to be the case.
Yeah, you can recover. Absolutely.
I want to talking about living with PTSD. One of the really difficult things I think people find is about the effect on relationships and the difficulty that they have maintaining close, warm, intimate relationships with their loved ones. And I'm happy for any of the panel to comment on this, but again, perhaps if I could ask Talissa or Jeff, did you feel that it affected your relationship with your loved ones?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. It was one of the key drivers for me seeking treatment was the effect that I could see I was having on my wife and children. And when I was running Home Secure Heroes, we had 100 veterans come into that program, and in nearly every case, the final straw before them becoming homeless or attempting suicide was family breakdown. The effect on family is dramatic. And if the family's been dealing with someone with PTSD for a long time, they're going to need help too.
I think it's a very important point, isn't it? And in fact, we did some research a while ago that showed exactly that the main reason people came into treatment was because their partner said, I'm going to leave you if you don't get treatment. Yeah. It wasn't really the symptoms. But yes, did you want to say anything about your relationships or how it affected relationships? Did you find it had an impact?
Yeah, absolutely. It had a massive impact. I sort of had probably 3 failed relationships during my rehabilitation. So yeah, it's certainly something that takes its toll. But what is really interesting when you start to talk about significant others is they are the people sort of because they're at the coalface that are going to probably pick up that something's not right, perhaps before the individual. Like we've spoken a lot about identification and things like that. And I think VVCS is good in the idea that perhaps they can initiate, even support indirectly, because they of course are eligible for education, advice, support, etc. So I think that's also really important as well.
So 50%, and Mark, 50% of the families we saw last year, all the counselling we saw was with families. So we don't just see the members, we also see the families. And our most common reason for people coming in is relationship issues. So it's the relationship issue that often will get people through the door. And that, like Jeff's story, that then allows us to build a level of trust that allows us to get to the issues around trauma and the deeper issues that need to also be dealt with.
That's a really interesting point, though, about 50% of your contacts at VVCS being families. So that's a really important message to get out there, isn't there, that if you've got family members who are struggling or want to know how to help, which is what I'm going to go on to now, VVCS is a good place to start. But I did want to pick up on your comments there, Talissa, and go on to the area of how do we help someone who's got PTSD and what do we need to do? And again, perhaps to start with you two before coming to the others, what do you think was helpful in terms of what people could do, your loved ones or friends or mates? What can people do to help someone? Do you want to kick us off?
Look, ultimately it's going to come down to the individual, but if you look at my case, I didn't recognise I had PTSD. My wife took me to couples counselling and I stayed. So, there will be partners who are watching this screen thinking, my loved one has got an issue, how do I help? Well, the help is there. You've got to contact VVCS. That's what I did. That's all they do is deal with traumatised veterans and their families, and they're there to help. So really, the hardest thing is making that first step, making the decision to reach out for help.
Yeah. So gentle encouragement in that direction.
Absolutely, or
support,
seek help for yourself, and eventually a partner will follow.
Yeah. Yeah. Would you go along with that, Talissa? Any?
Yeah, I completely agree. But I think obviously. Where I come from with Modern Soldier, we've tried very hard to develop education resources that people can sit at home with their families and watch. And I think, VVCS starting this webinar and sort of bringing that level of education and support forward into people's homes, making it more accessible online, etc., is definitely something that can help people in a non-invasive way, people that are trying to come to terms with that they have the condition or they don't have the condition. I think this is definitely accessing these sorts of resources, these sorts of webinars are definitely a way that you can support people and people can support themselves.
Yeah. Would either of you, Andrew or Stephanie, like to add anything on this issue about how to help someone? How would you advise a loved one to help their partner with PTSD?
Well, I think that the add-on thing to say, above and beyond how important the family and the partner becomes in terms of accessing that individual originally, they also take on a really significant role in the ongoing treatment. So the more a partner or a family can be involved in that individual's treatment, there is research across the board in mental health conditions that the greater the outcome will be for the individual. So I'd also say that the partner also has a really important aside from support, a really important, almost active role to play in the treatment of the individual in terms of helping them very much with a lot of the psychological skills we give them about self-monitoring for symptoms, getting a symptom early before it builds, and then putting into place the effective mechanisms to de-escalate that.
And I just add the point that I can remember giving a presentation with a whole group of young soldiers, and we talked about the importance and what partners can do and where partners fit in. And then one of the young soldiers came up to me afterwards and said, "Ma'am, I can't say it, I'm stuffed," is a better way to say it, because I don't have a partner. So I think it's also important for us to think about the peers, think about the parents in this, the other support networks other than just the significant others. And also that last piece is always think about the impact on the children. So what support should we be putting in place for the children that are living in this environment, which is like the book that Talissa started. So you have that conversation with the kids. It is not their fault about what's going on, just making sure that the children understand that they haven't done anything wrong and supporting them to also have some time out.
You must have some kind of telepathic power, Stephanie, because I've got a question here from Margie asking really about what effect it can have on children if the parent has PTSD. I guess anybody could take it, but pretty dramatic, difficult?
Yeah, it's been shown, in fact, there was some research done on the children of Vietnam veterans which showed poorer mental health outcomes for those children across a number of different symptom sets and outcomes. So not only when we're helping the individual are we helping them and their relationship, but we're also helping prevent that kind of intergenerational effect that can bleed onto the kids. So important.
I think it's important to say that for the veterans out there who know they're impacting their family, it's not your fault. You're suffering an illness, and these are the symptoms of the illness. And that's why it's so important to get treatment. It's not just about you, it's about your family.
That's a very good point, isn't it? And I think also it's really important for the partners to remember it's not their fault either.
Absolutely.
And because I think it's very easy to blame themselves and say, I'm not looking after my partner well enough or whatever. It's not your fault either. And it's about, I suppose, being able to work together as a couple or as a family on finding a solution and work collaboratively on getting through this one.
Yeah, and people are resilient. Kids are resilient. Get the treatment and you'll move on with your life and have a happy, productive life. So will kids.
Yeah.
Which is a really good point, because kids love their parents, you know?
No matter what.
No matter what, yeah. And our job is to try and help those families get on with giving a meaningful and productive life and minimise an impact and get rid of the symptoms as quickly as we can.
I just want to, we've got to wind up any second now, but there was one question that's come through a few times, so if I can just run it quickly. The question is really about, do you have to go on combat missions? Do you have to be deployed in combat missions in order to develop PTSD, or can you get it from other things? And I guess, either to Steph, would you like to take that one quickly?
Oh, really quickly. I always say this. The bottom line is PTSD occurs, it's an injury occurs that when you are facing a life-threatening event or something that shatters your sense of self. So that can occur whether you are walking through the New South Wales bush looking for victims of an Australian bushfire, which is just a horrific event, or if you're on operational deployment, or if you're asked to go and do something really tough doing disaster support in somewhere like Bande Aceh. So we ask Australians to go and do tough stuff. Just like when you go on to State of Origin, we put people onto the field, we'll know there will be injuries. We ask people to go and do tough things in the ADF. It is therefore about putting in place as much resilience as we can to get them ready for being in the big game, making sure that when we come home we give them opportunities to come forward for help, and lastly, making sure that there is that free and easy to get to mental health care. So when they're ready to put their hand up, there's someone there to help.
Can I just add something there?
Yeah.
The answer that person's looking for is service is enough. If you're struggling, your symptoms are as real as anyone else's, and it doesn't matter whether you're deployed or not. Do not feel guilty if you didn't deploy. It is what it is, and service is enough.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And to state what I hope is the blindingly obvious, it's not an indication that you're weak or that you're a coward or that you're lacking moral fibre, as they used to say. It's nothing to do with that. This is an injury that any of us could get if we're exposed to the right kind of stuff. So whatever you do, don't go blaming yourself for having it. Look, I've thoroughly enjoyed this discussion. We could keep this going for a very long time, but unfortunately the clock is ticking away. So we're going to have to bring things to a close. And I wonder if I could ask the panel whether each of them would like to make just a few brief closing comments, a few take-home messages or key points that they would like to leave our audience with. I might start with you, Jeff, since we started with you last time. Any just final comments?
Look, you're not a passive actor in all of this. You can choose to do something about it, but it is really tough, but it's not as tough as living with this for the next however long until you fall over and you're forced to get help. So please do something now. The help is there and the evidence is there to support that it works.
And it's a great point, isn't it? It's not as tough as living with this for the rest of your life is going to be. Get some help. Talissa, some final comments.
Very much the same as Jeff. My take-home comments would be that to encourage people to be empowered in this process, the more control and contribution you can have, active contribution to your rehabilitation, the better your health outcomes are going to be. Set goals for yourself. If you're going to commit to a therapy, set timelines, have ideas of what you'd like to achieve. Same if you're going to start a medication regime. And be really open and keep that sort of line of communication going with your health professionals.
I love that. Sorry, I love that point about being an active participant in your treatment. I think that's so important. We kind of, many of us grew up with a traditional medical model where you go to the doctor and you get fixed and you go away, But actually recovery from PTSD is a collaborative process with your therapist and with your support network and all that kind of stuff. So I love that idea of being an active participant in your own recovery. Very important. Andrew, some final take-home comments.
From a medical point of view, PTSD is a very treatable condition. Okay, do not wait to come into treatment. You are suffering needlessly if you have some kind of concern or belief that you don't deserve to have the condition or that feeling that you are weak. This is all just getting in the way of you leading a better, happier life. So come in, see the people that you need to see, participate in your treatment and get well.
Thank you, Andrew. I agree entirely. And Stephanie?
Very quickly, what I would like to do is I'd like to thank Jeff and Talissa. The only way we will break down the stigma around mental health is where people are willing to talk about it and to talk about how tough it is, but also recovery. And all respect to you guys for doing this for us today. I can't thank you enough. For those of you who did not get your questions answered, we are going to produce a fact sheet. So if we didn't cover what you were hoping for us to cover, the team in the background hopefully will cover it in the fact sheet for you.
Thank you, Stephanie. I would like to remind you all, if you could, to fill in the feedback evaluation before you log out. It's really important to help us understand what works for you and how best to provide these webinars. We'll also email you a link to the video and podcast of this session in the very near future. But now I would just like to say thank you very much indeed to all our participants. Thank you so much for joining us today and for your engagement, your active engagement in the process. I've really enjoyed it and found it very, very valuable. And I would particularly like to thank all our panel members, Andrew, Talissa, Jeff and Stephanie, for being with us today. So thank you all, and goodbye for now.